So I have been delving into and researching Brigid for a number of years now, and it started off with a curiosity myself around the themes of womanhood, sort of hiding and covering, and then I was also interested in how stories, representations of history narrate our understanding of our world. So I worked on a collaboration with visual artist Margaret McNulty, and that was thanks to Creative Ireland project funded by Kildare County Council and Roscommon County Council, and we worked together exploring the sense of place and heritage symbolising Brigid. And we're looking at archives and artefacts and site visits. So that's sort of where I started off. And this project resulted in publication, again thanks to Kildare County Council, by Ireland House, of a book called Mantles, which is available in the public libraries. And after that then, more recently I'm currently engaged, thanks to Brigid 1500, in facilitating workshops here in this lovely library with a wonderful group of writers, and we had called these sessions Writing Our Way to Brigid, and it literally is that. It's an exploratory, interactive series of workshops in which, again, we're all learning from each other. So what I've come to believe is that there isn't a singularity to Brigid, as Kildare historian Alice Curtain declared in the 1950s, although many accounts are singular. But I really believe that if we decode the myths and the stories through a 21st century lens, what we get are multitudes of Brigid. And we can come to comprehend that what she does is unite people and places through dialogue and a deep understanding of the human condition. The human imperative to make and consume stories runs deeply, as Jonathan Goshko puts it in his book, The Storytelling Animal. We are soaked to the bone in story. And I really think that it is through story that we come to know about Brigid. So I'm going to talk about three things today. I'm talking about reading Brigid, so I'm looking, obviously the sort of crossovers between Mario and Sister Rita. I'm looking at an acting Brigid and then embodying Brigid. So I'm going to explore how these are intrinsically connected to story, to land, and then to power, and that seems to be one of the themes we're all looking at. So I think in examining records of devotion to Brigid, the importance of not only what is said, but how, when and why can reveal important context and therefore knowledge of Brigid. So I'm not going to be presenting any new truths. I'm not an expert. Scholars and historians have done that. But I'm going to share with you some aspects of representations, so representations of Brigid for specific purposes, and in lights that seem to me to be multitudes, and in ways that sidestep the orthodox singularity visions of Brigid, of which most of us are familiar. Now, many of the wonderful celebrations of the first public holiday in honour of Brigid in February just gone took their essence from the myths and stories about Brigid. Mancon Magana maintains in Listen to the Land Speak that myths appear to mould themselves with eerie accuracy to one's immediate concerns. Their chameleon-like qualities adapt to changing eras and audiences, and different facets of their wisdom can be decoded at different times. And it really ties in what Sister Rita was saying, because it is through the stories and myths that we can gain wisdom both about Brigid and from her. But which myths? Which stories? And are they really so specific to Ireland? Is it what makes Brigid ours, or Irish, or a Catholic icon, or saint, or woman, or goddess? And might we, as we explore Brigid, be prompted to question knowledge? So before we briefly examine what we know about Brigid, with acknowledgement that knowledge can be a fickle and changing thing, we must first ask ourselves, as Mary Condren did in her seminal The Serpent and the Goddess, what can we reasonably know about Brigid? And considering knowledge of Brigid, and this has been alluded to already, one of the most important things to remember is that we are in the worlds of Kazan, dealing with a period at the dawn of recorded history. And as such, there are very few accounts, written accounts, of individuals from that period. As we've heard, there are seven early medieval lives of Brigid, the most extensive of any Irish saint, and the earliest is that, as you've heard from Mario, by Cogitosus, which wasn't compiled until actually after 100 years after her death. I find that sort of mind-blowing. So, but of course, as we've also heard, the date and the year of both her death and her birth, vary among sources. So what can we know? So as I say, I'm not going to give analysis of the lives of Brigid because that has been done, and in fact I'll just recommend a few books around that, and it was very difficult to get even these few on a slide. So O'Hanlon and Knowles for analysis of authorship and accuracy of the various lives, and more recently Cassan's work for that. And then O'Cahan has a new book out around the Festival of Brigid, people are interested in folklore, and then Mary Condren's The Serpent and the Goddess. But I think what I'm trying to get at, and what I'm talking about, and my interest as a writer really is with text, whether it's historical or fictional, as readers we must be mindful of the context. Literary critic Mendelow put it, writers tend to write with the terms and with the attitudes of their times. The work, whether it treats of the contemporary situation or leads one to escape from it into an ivory tower, is explicitly or implicitly a social commentary on the time in which it was written. And this is what I find interesting. If we take that angle and start looking at what has been written about Brigid, we start to see things a little bit differently. So what has been written about Brigid, at least in my readings, had agendas of painting her in a certain light, as a goddess or a saint or as a woman or both, or all, and much of what was written about her, and many of the books devoted to her, actually did revolve around the shifting of power at the time in which they were written. So the texts of the lives could be seen as a reflection of the 4th and 5th centuries in which Brigid lived. They also reflect the shift of politics, religious, sexual, social, with the cementation of Christianity in Ireland. And the texts in which I encountered her told different stories. As I said, her birth year varied from text to text. She was a daughter of a nobleman or a chieftain, Dovetock, depending on which way we want to look at it. She was a daughter of a slave woman or a bondmaid, Brigid. She was both. She was raised by a druid. She was raised by a poet. She was pursued by a poet. So in all of the different modes of her, if you want to say, she is different. She is an outsider with an insider connection, because I think from the outset it seems she is never powerless. She's the daughter to a nobleman and a slave. So again, if we're thinking about transitions and sort of bordering two lands, as it were, there we have it. She was brought up by a poet, taught how to read the world around her, and I find that really interesting. I know we'll hear more about the animals later. And she used her power and strength to heal and to feed. Her generosity is frequently represented by the cloak that covers the land where she resided and presided, and she's frequently been described as generous. Interestingly, if we look at that word in the 5th century, generosity was the mark of the nobility, and one who freely dispensed ale to clients or overlord was deemed to be flathúlach, which means both generous and lordly, from the Irish flaith lord. And Knowles described Brigid as the mother house of a vast army of Erin's daughters. The Calendar of Angus, compiled around 1800, described her and her nuns as a shower of martyrs. So she was also, and this will be difficult to read, and again, I was thinking, how do I get everything that was, all the words that describe her, and it's sort of impossible, it's only literally a handful, but, I'm reading a few out because, you'll see now, a ladder to heaven for many souls. She was Brigid the hospitable, a virgin not alone in name but in truth, a pious maid, a wise and charitable woman, a handmaiden to Mary. But the language is what interests me here, because in all of the different descriptions, whether they're talking about Brigid the goddess or Brigid the woman or Brigid the saint or Brigid, there's a lot of movement in them. And I think this is interesting if we start looking at patterns of the words used to describe her, and there's always an expanse outwards, it's always around flow. And of course the symbols associated with her function as a goddess recur in the written stories told of her as a Christian saint. So we've got images of milk, of fire, sun, serpents, we've got themes of compassion, generosity, hospitality, spinning, weaving, smithwork, healing and agriculture, and they all run through the various lives. But it seems to me that she becomes these stories. It's almost as if she is representing herself and the stories themselves as acts of appropriation and recreation. So we're all aware that her sacred objects, her mantle, her hair and holy wells, were taken over into her Christian devotional forms. And she's often considered also to be a symbol of the spring, a maiden transforming on the eve of Imbolc, so February, which is also her Christian feast day. and the destruction of winter embodied in the Keylach. But here we have another example of a word, a bit like generosity, where it has a seemingly singular meaning. And Caille at first meant veil, and then it became incorporated into the word Cailleach, meaning none, and almost simultaneously in secular mythology, the word for old hag. So there's a lot of mixed meanings in there, and we sort of hang on to one rather than many. Again, it's the multitudes. And this, I'm quoting here Margaret McCurtain actually from her book, Adrian's Thread, Writing Women into Irish History, which I'd also recommend. But yet, if we consider the Cailleach and the maiden within their multiple meanings, and if we think that time perhaps is not linear but cyclical, we can see that the young and the old woman are actually twin aspects of the same energy. So she's neither the young vessel version nor the old hag. She's not opposed to the Cailleach. She is a woman of all ages. And like the reality in Tiernan Og, she is both and. She clearly lived a life of active community and spiritual service as an ordained bishop, acting on the strengths of her own desires, and despite or because of her early circumstances, born of a slave mother, drawn to working with the vulnerable in society, lepers, enslaved women and the poor, practically and spiritually. Indeed, as Angela Burke puts it, Brigid's identity as a spiritual mother of the Irish may have helped the emergence of St. Patrick as a spiritual father. And that's another one that I'm curious about. So many images in early 20th century Christian biographies and hagiography depicted her as a still robed figure, gazing or contemplating, and she's often surrounded by animals. Now these images are taken from a play that we'll talk about later. This is Iona, and this one is taken from Knowles. So where have I gone here? Yeah, surrounded by animals, birds, small sheep, rather than wild wolves or flowers blooming and bright. And the tone is always soft, though her expression serious. And in these images, she vacillates between the maiden and the virgin archetypes. She's passive but not active, although even in the text she reads like a woman who acted on the power that she possessed and claimed. These images seem to serve as visual instructions for chasteness and devoutness. And analysing the visual portrayal of women from the old masters to today's Instagram, Catherine McCormack notes that the maiden archetype seems to say that being a woman means waiting to be taken by force or force of circumstances, rather than acting on the strength of one's own desires. It was Brigid's prescribed legacy, shoehorned into woman as maiden, which experienced the violence of force and paved the way for women in Ireland. In 1152, the Synod of Kells put a stop to women and saved the then Abbess of Kildare from having a bishop's jurisdictional authority, which had begun with Brigid. And this, of course, followed on from the abduction and rape of More, Brigid's second successor, by the soldiers of Dermot MacMurrough in 1132, which, in the words of Mary Condren, symbolically and practically put an end to that lineage. The Brigid that I encountered in most early texts had, by the mid-20th century, been replaced by a particularly nationalistic Irish version. One which was about control and obedience, not humanity or nature. She appears pastoral rather than powerful, and her connection to Brigid the goddess seems to have all but disappeared. Yet, through many of the customs honouring and remembering Brigid, such as the making of breedogs, the biddy boys, the placing of rags onto branches of trees, the making of crosses and so on, the goddess is actually remembered, revered even, and entwined with the Christian Brigid. The National Folklore Archive School Collection, which was conducted over 18 months from 1937 to 38, has been digitised and is one of the best places to discover written, oral and visual accounts of these customs. Likewise, the Museum of Country Life in Castlebar in Mayo has a superb collection of British artefacts, and Maria mentioned crosses. They have an incredible collection of British, not only British, the traditional one that we know, but many crosses that were woven. And then I have, so we're better to engage and, to take part in these customs than in, your local libraries in Kildare, here we are, and in Sulas Freed at the Spiritual Centre in Kildare. I have just come from spending 3 days of a self-imposed retreat in the Hermitage, which was absolutely wonderful, so I'd recommend that. And there's also an annual Brigid conference held in Trinity College, which is run by Mary Condren and her team, so I'd recommend all of those for further details on that. But for now, just to finish up, sort of end the last bit of the talk, I'm going to talk about 3 20th century plays about Brigid's life. So these enactments, we're getting on to enacting Brigid, and I find this interesting because it's like finding other types of ways of seeing her and how she was enacted. So I think they serve not only as glimpses into the importance of how the myths and story of her through the centuries were used and retold for specific purposes, but also the importance of her as a symbol. And I believe that representations of Brigid in 21st century Ireland need not only move away from the singularity portrayals of Brigid, the patriarchal polarisation and or the goddess or saint, but actually to shine a light on the historiography and the hagiography of the woman and the myths. So the first play we'll briefly discuss was published in Dublin by Talbot Press in 1929, and you can see on the slide there the title, and there's St. Blah, and I like this quote here: "My story must not be an excuse for idleness." So the theme of work is so prevalent right across all these plays, and I really find that interesting. So it was written by Iona, in inverted commas, because with the pen name Iona we might assume that it was written by a woman. We might also assume that it could have been a nun, and this text touches on the sacred and on the feminine in the story of Brigid. And on the surface the narrative isn't that different from Knowles's account of Brigid in 1907, where he quotes the Book of Lismore, and he says, "Her type created the dove among the birds, the vine among the trees, and the sun among the stars." And it suggests Brigid's power and deep connection with nature. But what I find interesting is the subtext, and it's the subtext about the power of the body, about knowledge, about the portrayal of the nun's tightly knit community. So what is the play about? In it, a novice is in dialogue with St. Blah about St. Brigid, and it's the dialogue, the talking that I found interesting throughout all of the plays. So she recounts how the call of the cuckoo told her that she would find St. Blah in the garden by the herbs. And throughout this dialogue, the women, in the way of Brigid, conduct their conversation by reading the signs and symbols around them: the call of a bird, the wind, the ground, the shift in temperature or atmosphere. And the women surmise that the pillar of fire seen at Brigid's birth and at her veiling was meant to foretell the quick spreading of her influence and the warmth of her mother's love. But isn't the use of the word warmth interesting, and how the women talk about spreading and expanse? And for me it brings to mind not just the heat of the fire, but of her power. Brigid, don't forget, as we've heard from both our speakers already, welcomed male and females into her monasteries, which were safe houses for all who were considered other by society. And there are records also of her championing women's bodily health in a practical and non-judgmental way. Iona tells us she sees and feels everywhere the fruits of her sowing and the sense of the protection of her holy brat. Brigid feels powerful and feminine here, and again we get the sense of expanse and growth. And I wonder, could we stretch it and say that this text is an example of what French writer Hélène Cixous, in her essay The Laugh of Medusa, refers to as écriture féminine. In other words, the gaps, the silences and the unsaid, and of course the symbols in the narrative, are as important, if perhaps not more important, than the words. We have the idea, as Mario mentioned, about an open canvas here, and the idea of a pause for peace. So sort of pausing in the gaps, I think this is where we can gather meaning as well. So the enactment of Brigid and the representations of her are as important as vital as the narrative. And I ask, haven't women always found a path around silencing and censorship? And hasn't literature and performance and art always given us ways into speaking the unspeakable and embodying the unnameable? In 2 plays that I studied in the Brigidine archives in the Delaney in the Delaney archives in Carlow College, Brigid is international. She is literally spreading outwards. I know Sister Rita showed you sort of visually how this was, and we have it here in these 2 plays as well. Both plays are written by Brigidine sisters and teachers in Australia and performed by their female charges in 1951. And for me, the themes continue from Iona's work in 1929, and the symbols capture something of that écriture féminine, writing as Sue would have it, in white ink, harnessing the female power and writing with the body, not against us. In the first play, The Mantle of Brigid, nature is key too, but here we see Brigid's power not only confined to the island of Ireland, but right across Europe, and the play brings us through the ages. We start in the 5th century, in Act 1, to the mighty Oak of Kildare, where Brigid is visited by European scholars seeking aid. And then in Act 3, the children are uprooted but living and picnicking in the grounds of Castle Brown in 1797, prior to the penal days prophesied by Brigid. So we have a dual narrative in this play. We have Brigid's own history, as well as that of Ireland, including colonial oppression and censorship of expression. And then the final tableau, really interestingly, presents the children with St. Brigid standing behind in a white habit, holding a church and crosier. And the notes say to have Brigid as in this is a quote, as in a stained glass window, a backdrop throwing out a shadow of a figure. So rather reminded me of, I don't know if anyone knows O'Casey's The Plough and the Stars, where you have Pierce as a sort of figure in the window. And I thought, oh, isn't that interesting? So she's not speaking, but she's overseeing everything in sort of in a universal way. Now, reading through a 21st century political lens, this play could be seen to legitimise religious colonisation of Australian lands and Indigenous people, but actually I think it serves as an important record showcasing the work of the Bridging sisters with children in Randwick. Brigid is their guide as a universal protector and caring even for the most, and as a quote from the play, destitute. But I think, isn't it a reminder for us today that there are always others in our society who need help, care and understanding. In the second play, the caring motherly aspect of her is even more evident. She's in conversation with Nina, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, the saint who is always running across the Curragh, and we saw him earlier on. I might flick back because I want to find more about him. There he is, running along, and she Ninnidh, and he seemed to be always running, and Brigid in the records anyway repeatedly asked him why he was running so fast. And he ended up coming into the monastery and not running so much or so fast, or not being in a hurry. I always think of him, it's a message to sort of slow down, you know. So in the second play, he asks Brigid, from which land do they come? And he replies, from the land of the Franks, mother, from the far north land of the Picts, from Northumbria, from Germany and Spain. On my long journey to Holy Rome, I saw the ruin wrought by war in all these lands. We all pray that you will listen to their pleading. So it's a similar theme to the first play, so that Brigid and those who represent her and work in her name need to travel from Ireland in response to the pleas of those in need. And the rest of the play celebrates the Diamond Jubilee of the Foundation in Australia and encourages the girls to continue Brigid's work with the instruction, be enfolded in the protecting mantle of her. Again, we have sort of the enclosing and the protection of the mantle. So these are the disciples of Brigid following in her footsteps and continuing her work. And in these archives, knowledge is evidence of the changing history of Christianity, the eradication of the matriarchy of Brigid, and the firm establishment of the patriarchal church. The words of the sisters and Iona seem to resurrect the work of Brigid, reminding us of the important work of women. And despite the female power line being long broken by the church, I think with these three plays we see a continued narrative by women of work, of compassion, of warmth spreading. And in these plays there is a history that speaks of another narrative of Brigid and the women who have followed in her footsteps despite the passage of history. The subtext of the power shifts in the order could be said to echo the fall of the great mother goddess Mecca. In the words of Mary Condren, the true nature of the event is the matricide that lies at the heart of the patriarchal culture and the fall into patriarchal time and space that would have devastating consequences. So perhaps remembering Brigid is not also forgetting the work done by others for others, women for women and girls. The writings are important not so much for what is said, but how it is said. Talk, dialogue, chat. When if you think about it, mid-20th century, at the height of the power of the Catholic Church, and why to put into words celebrations of the achievements of the sisters to show devotion to Brigid. But in between all of this is the unspoken, that the female voice at that stage in our society and culture had been so silenced. Literature and creativity opened up avenues for some sort of expression, despite general censorship, for a record and voices that recorded work being done, lives being lived, and not forgotten. A socio-political and gendered mirror, or to quote Sisu again, a feminine writing. And isn't that one of the roles of creative people? If we take Szaflowski's claim that art exists, that one may recover the sensation of life, it exists to make one feel things. Perhaps part of the role of 1500 is to move from the familiar perception, in this case Brigid, and to see the world through new eyes. And isn't how she has been portrayed in art and literature as important as how she has been portrayed by state, church and academic institutions, and having so many turn to writing and art in an effort to understand and reflect the mentality and history of those who disrupt peace. So what does it mean for 21st century creatives, let's say, trying to recreate Brigid across 16 centuries? So rather than look at just facts and evidence, I would like to consider the materiality of Brigid and what we can bodily know of her, just as we saw in Iona's play. I'm going to revisit my experience of visiting the relic of Brigid of Ireland in Dublin in the summer of 2021 in the monastery of Alphonsus the Red Nuns. And this experience for me seems to be the nearest connection I might have to the essence of Brigid, goddess and saint. I'd imagined myself in a cool dark oratory or a tiny stone chapel waiting for the relic to be brought out on a cushion, not a bright cheery reception with the slant of sunlight and the sound of birds. Sister Gabriel pushed the relic, encased in an oval shaped gold case with a glass cover, towards me, and what I saw was not the white cloak, the dress of ancient nuns, nor was it the colour of a distinct order of Ireland. I stared at the gold thread holding vibrant red wine wool in place, and it was thick and full, and not unlike wool on a sheep's back. It has power, Sister Gabriel said, as if reading my thoughts. There are primary relics, body parts, and secondary relics of personal effects or insignia, for example bells and belts and shoes, and items that have come into contact with the primary or secondary relics, such as pieces of cloth. My body felt it then, and still feels it. I had been touched by a tiny piece of a relic, and it felt more than secondary. The cloak of St. Brigid, from which this relic has been taken, is of course connected to Kildare, and Condren reminds us of the links between the goddess and saint, like the goddess is Macha and Tifi, who drew the boundaries of their forts with a pin taken from their brooches. So too Brigid is said to have drawn the boundaries of her monastery at Kildare by spreading her cloak as far as it would reach. Every vision and interpretation of Brigid starts and ends with place, whether it's where she was born or died, set up her monasteries, where she travelled. Crone Hill in Offaly, where Brigid got into difficulty in a bog on her way to surrender to the authority of the Christian faith, was a known gathering point for millennia and the inauguration site for kings of that region. And alongside place, the longest lived and most venerable of trees, the oak, is a key symbol of Brigid and her life. And out of more than 60,000 townlands in Ireland, over 13,000 are named after trees. The most common of all is oak. And a further glance at the context in which Brigid's history, myths and stories stem from, we see the importance of local place rather than 19th century nationhood, and it played a crucial role in the transition to Christianity. Symbols and references to Brigid can be found, as Sister Rita has outlined, throughout Europe. O'Cahan reminds us of the reflections and ramifications of the story of Brigid and her festival, and that they can be found in the Gaelic-speaking Highlands and Islands of Scotland and from Scandinavia, where in the latter case the Irish and Scottish materials provide new vantage points from which aspects of Nordic, including Sami and Finnish folk tradition, can be viewed. So here is historical and folkloric evidence of Brigid, as is depicted in the 3 plays that we've examined, showing us her work and how she is spread across Europe and beyond. I think this echoes Brigid of the dramas that we examined, the universality, the commonality rather than difference, her power that unites rather than divides, the white ink on the page, the white cow, the white mantles and habits, the milk of birth and threshold, reminding us always not to forget about the work. So I would say let's continue to move towards stories that are multi and complex, as human experience is, and let us try and consider both and. Night follows day, but day follows night. After all, the natural, human and divine worlds coexist. And as a storytelling nation, haven't we always moulded fact into fiction, lore into mythology, against the background of and support of the natural world? What we are able to see remains conditioned by the archetypes and visual language available to us. But when we change the way we see, the things we see also change. We must look beyond the words on the page and see what is behind them, for here, underneath and very much attached to nature and the land, are the vital stories. So I'd like to end just with those 3 quotes here, and the key one for me is the last one, which is the value of a work of art is where it can take you where you could not go on your own. And I think if we take that, and then what we're trying to do is bring people on a journey with us through our creations. So thank you very much to Sult Artists for inviting me to talk, and to my co-speakers. And I'm really, really looking forward to the art trial in next year, and to hearing our other 2 speakers speak today. Thank you very much.